and watched for 10 minutes. We checked his vitals. Somehow, Michael was not injured. He only fell asleep, standing up. It is an eerie feeling to watch a man on the verge of losing his mind. The curtains in his apartment fluttered nervously in the wind. Every few hours, Michael roused himself from sleep and checked the window nervously, then returned to his perch by the bedroom door. He repeated this trend a few times throughout the night. He didn't get back in bed all evening. The next day, Michael got a promotion. We had nothing to do with it. We watched the whole thing from a hidden cubicle camera. Michael's boss sounded truly grateful. She considered Michael's job performance to be worthy of recognition. To boot, the firm had been particularly successful that quarter. That meant a big bonus. The shit-eating grin on Michael's face told us that he considered the experiment to be responsible. Our subject got very drunk that night. We did not capture the bar in our video feed. I did, however, catch his walk of shame home sometime around 2 in the morning. I adjusted the audio and found the guy talking to himself once again. I don't want to. Are you sure? I don't want to. Michael walked into the apartment and flicked the light switch. The room remained quiet and empty. He repeated his favorite little phrase over and over again. He futzed around in the living room in an apparent panic. I don't want to. Are you sure? I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. Are you sure? I don't want to do it. It annoyed me, to be honest. I started to doubt my colleague. Unstable subjects tend to skew results. I had not considered the more dire consequences at the time. Who's he talking to? I asked. Tom didn't answer. Michael walked toward the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water from the fridge. His movements seemed extremely erratic. The overall behavior reminded me of an animal with rabies, especially the way one leg dragged behind the other. Suddenly, as if hearing something, Michael stopped and stared out of the kitchen window. The water spilled all over the floor. Michael stayed in that position for 5 minutes. Then, he offered one last line in the direction of the kitchen door. Are you sure? Then he sprinted outside without another word. Switch to camera 4! Tommy barked over my shoulder. I did as I was told. I swear, that's it. The memory of this still keeps me up at night. Michael's drunken shape came back into focus on the green grass of the apartment complex. The receiver taped to his chest captured rapid breaths as his haphazard footsteps traced the path that led in only one direction. Headlights and horns blasted only 50 feet away. The freeway. Tom, this is a problem. This is a big fucking problem. I must have repeated that phrase at least 1,000 times, but my pleas were ignored by my wide-eyed companion. I grabbed the office phone and quickly tried to find an emergency contact. All the while, Michael teetered in between traffic carelessly like a missing toddler. There's nothing we can do, Tom muttered. What do you want me to say? Michael's body exploded the moment it met the tractor-trailer. He died that day. Our benefactor compensated the family handsomely. Litigation was temporarily avoided. The God experiment continued with the remaining subjects, uninterrupted, for 5 weeks. The God experiment's second trial claimed a 29-year-old woman. Her name was Caroline. According to the bio, the subject stood at 5 feet 3 inches. She weighed 135 pounds. Caroline had dirty blonde hair that met mildly hazel eyes, with astigmatism affecting both lenses. Survey results indicated a surprising lack of romantic partners in the picture. Regardless, she was a female who pursued men exclusively. That fact checked Tommy's second box. So enter subject 002. Caroline lived alone in a small apartment close to home. She preferred it that way. The short distance made it easy to check on her mother, Jacqueline, twice a day. Jacqueline suffered from stage 2 breast cancer, and the debilitating results of chemotherapy just started to take effect around the time of our study. But she never complained. Some had it worse. Her dad died from the same disease years back. Nobody wanted that. Her brother was working now, and Caroline considered that a good thing, but no one knew how long Sean could stay employed. Minimum wage positions tended to be seasonal. She told friends on the phone that the new job seemed lucrative but scary. What if something could happen to him? If she lost either one, she might just lose her mind. And so, late at night, Caroline prayed. I liked to listen to the audio while Tommy snored in the hallway. She asked God for the same thing we all do. A game-changing cure for her mom, maybe, who started to look thinner every day. Perhaps her brother could land a manager position at that new store in town.
He has so much potential,
she would say. Her voice rose slightly past a whisper every time she repeated that line.
Give him the strength to apply himself this time.
Caroline also asked God if it would be time to meet a man worth the wait. That last one seemed a lot less important than the rest, though, and stayed noted as such in all prayers. She repeated the routine every single night. Nobody ever answered. That changed in the second week of our study. Jacqueline had an important doctor's appointment in the morning. Her daughter stayed up late in the night with worry. She said 17 prayers, 6 Hail Marys, 6 Our Fathers, and 5 personalized messages to the big man himself. Somehow, the kid got something right. Excitement overwhelmed the car's audio the moment the two of them got inside. Jacqueline spoke with an apprehensive tone at first.
Wait, I can't hear that, Doctor. He mumbles when he talks. The chemo actually worked?
The backdrop of the corporate parking lot suddenly painted a beautiful scene. Mother and daughter embraced for several long moments. Static from their windbreakers corrupted the microphones for a moment. They both wiped tears from their eyes as they sat back in their seats.
The chemo actually worked.
Caroline coughed a couple of times to clear her voice.
Doctor said you need some follow-up scans, some new medicine, but no more treatments.
She paused and looked at her mother with admiration.
You're in remission, young lady.
I paused the video. The moment caused me to tear up as well. The poor, battle-worn woman smiled brightly underneath her wig. She looked young again. I guess the recognition of salvation took off 10 years. It was beautiful to see something good happen, finally, in a string of so much bad. Tommy appeared over my shoulder.
Screenshot that.
I did as I was told. We resumed the video a second later.
Call your brother. He worries.
Caroline's mother usually wore a gruff and unfriendly expression, but today, nothing could contain the excited sparkle in those weary eyes.
And let's get a drink. Oh, he's on speakerphone. He called us.
Caroline giggled. Sean, can you hear us? The confident young man crackled through the secondary audio.
Well, guess who just became a full-timer?
Both of Caroline's wishes came true that same day. And so, the family celebrated well into the night. They chose a restaurant on the outskirts of town. We did not have this location on our camera feed. I hope they had a good time. Once again, our cameras caught a drunk subject stumbling home after hours. I was alone at the time. When I enhanced the audio, her nervous voice caused my blood to run cold.
Are they okay? Okay. Are they okay? Okay. Are they okay? Okay.
Caroline mumbled the words on a loop like a depressing song.
Are they okay? Okay. Are they okay? Okay. Are they okay? Okay.
Tommy promised his wife a real dinner for the first night, and who knows how long. I promised to cover. I called and texted him about 1,000 times. Subject 002, same symptoms. We can't let this fucking happen again. Answer the fucking phone, Tommy. I did not receive a response. Caroline teetered around her family room in confused, stuttered steps. She repeated her new phrase to the empty room a few more times. The whole thing seemed bizarre. Too bizarre for just a crazy night of drinking. I did not think drugs could have been involved, at least not voluntarily. The girl didn't even keep alcohol in the house. After 5 minutes, Caroline walked to the door and stepped into the rain. The temperature read 43 degrees Fahrenheit. She did not have shoes, a sweater, or a hat. I swapped through views as quickly as possible in order to catch up. After a few moments, the second camera found our subject in her backyard. A dusty cornfield sat on the corner of the rural property, and Caroline walked toward it slowly. She did not look worried or appear to be in a rush. The mic caught cool, calm, and collected breaths through the rain. In fact, for the first time in the entire experiment, she seemed at peace. Blood pressure and vitals lowered to healthier levels. Her pulse did not indicate any issues. Caroline reached the edge of the cornfield before long. She turned and looked one last time toward the house and smiled. Part of me still feels like she smiled at the camera. Without warning, a blunt object struck her head from behind. I sat dumbfounded and helpless as a blurry shape dragged our subject away. The audio caught one last line before the mic fell into the maze.
Are they okay? Okay.
Subject 002 is still missing to this day. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to watch 7 lives fall apart on camera? Picture yourself on a train ride over a mountain covered in ice, and you hear the avalanche. A monotone rumble of shifting rocks and billowing snow overloads the cold air. That noise can only mean one thing, right? You're sure death is coming, but no one in the carnage screams. No one is crying, and instead, it's calm and quiet, right up until the end. Subject 003 was a transgender male named Courtney. The participant stood 5 feet, 6 inches. He weighed 150 pounds. In the photograph, dark, unblemished skin met stylish black hair, shaved short on one side. Courtney was in a relationship with a female, but the happy couple had not moved in together. I considered camera placement to be ideal inside the cramped studio apartment. From an early age, Courtney exhibited clear signs that birth did not match the right body. Early onset identity crisis led to complexities, including depression and anxiety, that went untreated throughout the teenage years. The madness ended when medical professionals took corrective measures to implement a lifelong dream. He worked in a high-paying job in the healthcare industry and held a padded HSA to boot. He paid for the whole procedure himself. Even still, Courtney's parents ceased all communication. That fact haunted him. Courtney never considered himself religious. Survey results indicated that, with a few major concepts. He believed in a God, he believed in judgment and punishment, and some sort of peace in the end for us all. Like everybody, Courtney had his own issues with the big man or big lady. On the topic of omnipotence, he wrote, "If there is a puppet master, I am his missing string." I found that sort of dark, but he still prayed for some things. The messages delivered by his bedside in the dark of night were to no one in particular. Each offering began with something like, "I don't know if anyone is listening, but..." because it felt safer that way. Easier not to damn yourself with one if you've got a chance with another. He prayed for his family to talk to him again. He prayed for acceptance. He prayed for his little sister's health, and another promotion, and better medication, and less makeup. But most of all, he asked for something most may be able to understand. He prayed for enough money to make his girlfriend a wife and start a life. In the second week of our study, things seemed to be heading in the right direction. A late-night conversation in the bedroom with Samantha broached the topic of marriage. His little sister, Sarah, texted often and claimed that she felt fine. The course of his career continued to trend upwards, and bonus season claimed another happy participant. However, we began to notice similar symptoms the Tuesday after Subject 002 went missing. Courtney's mother called that morning. The conversation started pleasant enough. She talked about herself, mostly. The gossip at the library, favorite television shows, the usual. However, the topic eventually led to where it always does. Her father's drinking problems. Dad must have heard the last part when he walked by. He offered one soul-crushing bit of advice into the receiver while Mom tried to escape the room.
"Tell my little girl I say hello."
Tom and I were both in the office at the time. The results of that single sentence were almost too horrible to bear. Courtney was in his car and approaching a bridge. The phone line disconnected, but he still screamed into it anyway.
"Mom? Dad? That's it? You have nothing else to fucking say to me? Why'd you even fucking call me? Why the fuck did you do this to me?"
The line beeped without sympathy. Something inside the poor man's eyes looked dead inside. It did not require 720p video inside the dashcam to properly characterize the look of defeat and utter anguish. I wanted to help him, but as always, there was no time. Plus, the rules of the God experiment forbade interaction. Tommy looked ready to make an exception when Courtney pulled over and got out of the car. We switched cameras. Our participant stood on the narrow sidewalk and stared into the distance for a couple of minutes. Then he walked forward. The fog had started to pour in at that altitude. Rain had drifted in and out of the area all evening. Quietly, Courtney began to whisper one line on loop. just like all the others. I am your missing string. 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 Tommy appeared really worried at that moment. He grabbed his cell phone and furiously thumbed a text to a number I did not recognize. Then he reached over and paused my video, and instead pointed to an opposite monitor. The camera 4 showed the inside of the car. "What the fuck is that?" he asked. It was impossible to see any features, but one fact seemed clear. A black shape sat very still in the back seat, at about medium height. After a few moments, the door opened beside it and something exited in the opposite direction. We frantically adjusted the cameras to get a view, but there was no one else in sight. I resumed the video and checked on Courtney. He dangled carelessly off a support beam as I repeated my favorite slew of curses. The cold, hard ground several hundred feet below did not seem to be worrying to anybody but Tom and me. "Where do all missing strings go?" Courtney asked our audio feed. Then, he slipped off his shirt. He unattached the microphone. He finished one final sachet around the pole. Then, Subject 003 took a dramatic swan dive into the below. I still wonder about his question. I don't think anybody really knows. Michelle was a transgender female who never quite adjusted to the cameras in her home. That fact alone made her much smarter than the rest. It was an unmistakable and itchy feeling to be watched. Some people recognize it better than others. The sensation can creep through your guts like a virus. It makes all those little hairs on your neck stand on end. Survival instincts implore human beings to seek shelter in these situations. It is always best to avoid the eyes of the hunter, but if there is no way to be sure of safety, what if the lion has eyes in every corner of the jungle? Subject 004's survey indicated a hermit-like behavior. She had few family and friends. Her employer was an online blog that allowed employees to work from home. The topics of conversation for this site were nothing short of the usual dog shit you see in National Enquirer and similar publications. Popular headlines included, "Woman marries alien, Bigfoot kept lumberjack as love slave," and more of the usual attention-seeking crap. The more absurd, the better. Michelle had been with the company for nearly 10 years. Her articles on conspiracy theories built a reputation that stretched across the country. Nevertheless, the layoff at corporate headquarters claimed her job in the second week of our study. As with past participants, our video caught all the gory details. Our subject cried in bed for days. She did not leave her apartment for a week. Doctor appointments stayed canceled, groceries were delivered to the house, and the few friends remaining offered nothing outside of a few half-hearted text messages. So it goes. Michelle pursued the employment market relentlessly. Personally, I thought this indicated a willingness to take life more seriously. The resume compiled online looked impressive to my untrained eyes. She called and begged several other companies that claimed to be hiring. She filled out 1 million applications online, but I suppose the job market is tough for the type of person who once wrote that her landlord is a lizard. Most newspapers insisted on more serious experience. A few fellow blog sites openly laughed during interviews on the phone. The windfalls of hope and repeated disappointment became tough to watch. All these factors added up left Michelle at home, all day, alone. She turned to alcohol somewhere around the 3rd week. Tommy blamed the strange behavior that followed on her excessive drinking. I remained unconvinced. The warning signs that I had come to identify seemed to be repeating themselves in Subject 004. One hungover morning, Michelle moved a chair to a blind spot in the kitchen. She sat there for 4 hours. The entire apartment stayed quiet during this time. When Michelle emerged, she seemed suspicious of everything from the cat to her own shadow. She searched the apartment endlessly for something, and that made us worry. During setup, Tom etched one of our cameras into the wood of her nightstand. Sure enough, she found it, after tearing apart the whole room. She talked to us openly from that point on. That revelation certainly affected our test results, but as always, our responsibility stayed the same. Interference and correction did not present itself as an option. We were only observers. The camera became a prop of Michelle's bout of self-destruction. She carried that and a bottle of Jack Daniels everywhere. She talked to both as if live streaming. Most of the messages were incoherent and similar to the nonsense she used to peddle for a living.
Reporting live from the kitchen, water has turned to a mysterious brown color. Back to you, Doc. Reporting from the bedroom, something is scratching underneath my floor. Can you guys hear that? Reporting from the den, someone is outside my door. Is that one of you?
Nothing I saw or heard on screen confirmed her theories. However, my concerns started to get more serious when Michelle refused to sleep. 2 days without rest turned to 3, and 4, and 5. Her behavior became manic. On several occasions, I caught her staring at the walls for hours at a time. Soon enough, Michelle found the remaining cameras. She took to hiding in blind spots that made it impossible for me to see her after that. The frequency and length of the live streams radically decreased. I hoped that wherever she went, Michelle finally found some sleep. The apartment was always very quiet during that time. There were no other voices inside. One morning, many days later, someone knocked at the apartment door. Michelle had not been outside in 2 weeks. Tom snored so loud in the lab that I had almost missed it. The knock started out quiet and unassuming. After a few unanswered raps, it grew more aggressive, until it soon became an absolute pounding that stirred my colleague from his sleep and caused Michelle to sprint into my line of sight in a panic.
Do you guys hear it now?
We did.
What do I do?
I had no idea. Tom pulled out his phone again. He had a block on the device that obscured my vision from the side. I asked him angrily about the text messages. He started to answer me just as Subject 004 walked over to the door. "Shit! She cannot answer that door!" he muttered instead. Michelle could not hear us. She looked through the peephole neurotically, and then she shrugged her shoulders and caught a quick, nervous breath and unlocked the chain. "Why don't we have visibility in the hallway?" I asked, fearing the answer. It came a second later. A gunfire erupted in our headphones. A bullet caught Subject 004 in the head. I knew immediately that our Michelle was dead. She did not even have time to scream. Tom pulled the plug from every computer, monitor, and power grid in the lab. Video and audio disappeared in kind. He fired off a few more rapid-fire text messages. In a few short moments, the God experiment fell completely offline. His next words removed any doubt in my mind. "We have to help the remaining subjects. We're running out of time." God found me in the middle of a hurricane. We were absolutely flying down an ill-advised stretch of I-95. Storm warnings vibrated the phones in our pockets like a pair of dildos. That evening, the road stayed slick with white waves of spitting rain and bits of black ice that stuck to the asphalt like butter. I clung to the steering wheel and kept my eyes on the road, but still begged my friend to fill me the fuck in. "Who are you texting? What's going on? Where are we going? Say something!" Tom tore his eyes from the phone and finally turned to face me. "How do you think we have any money?" I stared blankly. I never really considered that fact. Studies always had donors. It could be anybody. Individuals, institutions, companies, or organizations, as long as they all followed the letter of the law, which we did not. My colleague flicked my forehead like an asshole. I swatted his hand away and tried to focus on the road. "Who do you think paid for all the computers in the back seat, or the lab we sit in every day? How about the extremely expensive video equipment we used to monitor 5 individuals the weeks they were murdered?" 5? Priyanka is... Tom guffawed at my apparent stupidity. "Take the next exit." I did as told. The dripping water through the window made me shiver involuntarily. "I did it myself this time," he mumbled. "Better that way, for a dissident. Nothing like a little arsenic and her girlfriend's pepper chicken, "What the fuck are you talking about?" I asked. "You have to talk to me, man. I'm the one driving." Tom took a long look at me before he finally sighed and replied. "There's a man behind the curtain, Justin. There always is. We need to get away from him." A massive oak tree fell from the side of the road. It landed about 20 feet ahead. That should have given me enough time to stop, but the brakes in my car screeched unevenly. I did my best to swerve, and so we didn't crash immediately. Tom had time to offer one final line in the chaos before wooden splinters ripped apart the paneling of my mid-size SUV. "There's always a man behind the curtain." The next few moments in my memory is a mixture of broken glass and hurling objects. I can remember the tumbles pretty clearly. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 suspensions of gravity in total. Seatbelts kept both of us stationed securely to the vehicle. but the same could not be said for the piles of electrical equipment. The good news was that the last turnover put the car right side up. The bad news was that it was in the middle of a New Jersey swamp, and Tom was losing a lot of blood. He faded in and out of consciousness, and my arm felt broken. Nonetheless, adrenaline allowed me to pull my colleague from the car and lay him down on the hill. My middle-class pipe dream sunk into 2 feet of mud with all of our equipment. We were stuck. The accumulating rain made it impossible to drag ourselves up. I tried to stop Tom's bleeding with my shirt. That was about as successful as trying to stop a spout with a pin. The worst wound the old man sustained struck his wrinkled old head. Red bits of skin and flesh poked through my white shirt. I don't think he had much time left. I do think the integrity of that moment made him reconsider a few things in life. He would have tortured her. The words again made me feel cold inside. Why? Who is he? Why does he care? I don't understand. Tom, why would you kill one of our subjects? It was just like going to sleep. A pair of headlights arrived by the side of the road soon after. I could barely see the figure that gracefully slid down the embankment. He wore an impeccable black suit that fit his thin and agile form flawlessly. I waved and called out, "There's a man dying here!" But he did not reply. The rain started to erode the embankment we were lying upon. The shadow in the suit watched me struggle to hold up Tom's body with a broken arm and a couple of cracked ribs. He snorted audibly and said, "Good evening to you both," in an awkwardly confident tone. I tried to reply back. Help had arrived. I thought we were saved, but before I could, the man Tommy once called God shot him 2 times in the stomach. Then there was only one subject remaining in the study. Me. I wished I wasn't alive. That's such a bullshit statement these days. What do the kids call it? Basic? The very same line could be applied to waiting in the doctor's office with a common cold, or sneezing in someone's face, or using the restroom in a public place. It just doesn't mean anything anymore, you know? Exaggeration and veneer have taken the guts out of every word meant to imply the severity of my situation. Truthfully, now, let's try that again. I wished I was not alive. If you thought the devil capable of immense torture, then God will almost certainly offer you a pleasant surprise. He brought me somewhere inside. The drugs that coursed through my vein in an IV were unlike anything I had ever experimented with in college. Pain became something to rest my hat on when breathing was no longer a required chore. The shapes inside my teeming space blended together like 3 white rabbits shuffling through a surgery room. I felt insanity grip the corners of my brain and hold it tight like a vice. I prayed to death through gritted teeth and begged him to visit that night. But he didn't. Tommy knew about this fate. His last words told me everything I needed to know. There was always a man behind the curtain. I would like to talk about the God experiment. Through all the chaos of pain and pounding vibrations in my body, I could hear the voice as clear as could be. It boomed and resonated through the hollow room as if an echo. I spoke back as a humble servant prepared to meet my maker. Subject 005 is a little lady named Priyanka. She is a 25-year-old bisexual female. A white rod of lightning intercepted my mind. Again? Subject 005 was killed by Subject 6, Tommy. The pain grew worse. God did not like my answer. I asked him why. His response was a draw of a deep breath and a let out of an overwhelming sigh. The kid's too loopy. This is not working. We will have to try again later. I looked around the room and tried to take in my surroundings. The walls were stained with waves of brown water damage and growing mold. The floor felt concrete. My bare feet were tied up to the legs with a rickety wooden chair. I shook nervously.
Fuck!
God screamed in annoyance.
This is not the plan! This is not the fucking plan!
A female voice called out from somewhere in the background.
Life never fits the plan, Diego, but you are the handler on this one. Your fuck up!
The third deep tone murmured its support. Diego's reply seemed angry. I did not know why.
His memory is supposed to wipe. The feds tested it years ago. Hell, we have used these same drugs on Subject 6 for 6 years.
Is it too soon? The female's voice sounded downright cocky when she replied, It's not too soon, it just doesn't always work the way you want. Their voices converged in a cacophony of whispers too difficult to understand. Somewhere underneath all the horrible things churning inside of me, clarity approached. You're not God? I offered the words to the room in a daze. Oh, now he gets it. The male voice laughed again. Then he punched me in the mouth. Haven't you heard? The state is God. The G-man looked at the bruise on his fist while I spit a pool of blood in his direction. It all added up in that moment. The subjects were dissidents. They were destined to die because our government wanted them to die. Our purpose in the God experiment was only to ensure death came at the right time. We have to kill him. The Attorney General... The lady cut off her partner. The AG doesn't know anything. They both paused. Do you hear that? I took the momentum of the moment to throw my chair to the floor. The struggle that ensued did not favor my side. I broke the legs and managed to scurry free, but soon enough, the third giant crow wrapped his arms around my arms while the other two punched me. When Tom burst through the door to our unlocked room, I outright laughed at his sheer stupidity. The fat man was covered in blood. It dripped from his head and lab coat like an absurd C-rated horror movie. However, his next few actions were nothing short of heroic. Without them, I would not be alive to tell this story. Thank the Lord, Tom brought a big old gun with him. 2 bullets caught my attackers immediately. The third let go of me just before Tom shot him in the ankle. I stumbled out of the room and escaped the scene of the crime just in time. Tom caught 1 more bullet himself that night. He died alongside the same men that ruined his life. The government selected 7 subjects from radically different backgrounds. Their names were Mike, Caroline, Courtney, Michelle, Priyanka, Tommy, and me. The reason behind multiple genders and orientations seemed pretty simple. Our handlers wanted to prove a point during this run of the God experiment. Everyone is vulnerable at any time. Anyone can be taken care of outside of the public eye. The subjects we watched were targeted for execution by the same government that collected their taxes, and so on. There is no more apt description for our commanders-in-chief. The state is God. If you ask for more answers, I am afraid they are in short supply. For the past 6 months, I have been forced to hide. I do not know why feds allow me to be alive. I can feel their eyes every time I go to bed. Just before I submitted this final update, the camera on my laptop flickered red. The state is watching me. And they're watching you too. I only wanted someone else to see. I still remember the events of my awakening. It wasn't the first time I'd awoke in the tower. By that time, I had long since lost count. So many times, I had slipped into a brief unconscious respite, only for the searing pain to jolt me back to life, wailing in agony. Despite my cries of pain, I could always perceive that deep-throated incantation as I felt a very finely edged blade slowly carve away slivers of skin from my bare chest. During my endurance of the torments, I saw only darkness, the linen that firmly held my head bound, not allowing me to see my abuser. My wrists and ankles were bound painfully with wire, pinning them back and suspending me at least 4 feet from the stone floor as a human pendulum. The inability to use my extremities rendered resistance impotent. I could only scream and grind my teeth into the horse bit that gagged me as they sadistically continued to slowly rend flesh from sinew, savoring every second of my misery as they repeated their unholy chant. Sometimes, large patches of skin were stripped away. Other times, it was small slivers, targeted in the areas most sensitive to me. Either instance always resulted in me tearing my vocal cords in pain until shock would inevitably cause me to lose consciousness, only to have the damning sting of salt being cast into those exposed wounds rouse me back to life to continue their sinister rites. This occasion, however, I decided that I would fight against the urge to slip into the blissful darkness. I would bear the excruciating punishment until either they lost interest in my suffering or death took me. I could feel my molars dig further and further into the bit with every drawn-out second they spent flaying me alive, as the pain and the extra effort it cost me to stay awake made it seem as though many hours had passed. When darkness began to cloud my mind once again, unable to continue my endurance, I silently prayed that I would not wake again. With further descent into the clutches of eternal rest, I tried to make her face, her radiant smile, be my image of parting grace. The smiling face of my beloved Jennifer on the night of the festival, illuminated by the glow of the fireworks. Over my waxing screams, I tried to remember the sound of her laugh as she'd burrow her face into my chest. Just before the dark void would have me, however, I noticed the incantations cease. The chamber was quiet, save for my groans of pain. I then felt the linen around my eyes loosen until falling away completely, allowing gravity to pull my head downward to face the stone floor. It was at least a full minute before my vision could compose itself. Directly below me, perched in a pool of blood, was a cauldron containing the discarded scraps of my flesh. As much as the sight horrified and revolted me, I could only utter a weak moan, the frigid air in the chamber stinging my exposed muscle tissue. When I heard soft footsteps approaching, I arched my neck up to see my menacer. He wore a dark scarlet cloak with a hood that completely concealed his face and brandished a small knife in his left hand, dripping with blood. My eyes widened as he approached, the blade poised downward and outstretched. Panicking, I tried more vigorously to fight against my restraints. As before, it served me little as he grabbed my long hanging hair to force my face closer to him. Even held only mere inches away, I couldn't distinguish any features from under his hood. As he raised his blade over my face, I could once more hear the guttural chant. My throat, too weak and worn, I could only mutter a weak moaning as the blade sank deep into my forehead, scarring some manner of sigil or branding into it before cutting deep across the lengths of my arms and legs, allowing the viscous crimson to flow down freely onto the cauldron beneath me. When he finished, he then removed the horse bit from my mouth. The rush of unobstructed air caused me to cough and wheeze as I sputtered, my voice nearly depleted.
Who are you?
As to reply to my query, the acolyte cocked its head to the side and let out a deafening screech as I felt it push the index finger of its right hand into the cuts on my forehead. I felt a blinding flash of light seemingly come from within my eyes as I began to envision a small farmland with bright and healthy soil bearing many crops. I was overwhelmed, my senses overclocked and unable to properly process the heavenly display. for indeed it had been so long since such a sight had existed that I was sure they only existed in heaven. I saw, gathering the bountiful harvest, was a man and his boy. They laughed as they toiled, overjoyed with the fruits of their labors. Another flash led the vision to shift to the inside of a dark sanctuary where there gathered 3 hooded figures, clad in the same uniform red garbs as the one in front of me, all reciting the chant as they knelt and prostrate before a large pit, surrounded by candles and a tyrannical idol erected opposite of them, inanimately wielding its dominion over them. I let out a shrill yelp as I felt the acolyte's finger push harder into the wound, feeling the visions burn deeper and deeper within my mind. From inside the cavernous pit, I could see the man and the boy tearing each other apart, the both of them lost to some primal bloodlust in an attempt to cannibalize one another. I wanted it to stop, but was powerless to make it do so. As long as the acolyte's finger remained on my forehead, I was forced to continue experiencing the nightmare as I watched the adolescent tear at his father's jugular with his fingernails. The father retaliated by gouging the eyes of the boy, growling like a rabid hound. I felt the finger dig deeper into the carvings as I witnessed the boy somehow gaining the upper hand over his elder and proceeding to drive his father's head into the walls of the pit. Once the man's head was but little more than a mess of gore, the youth let out a series of deranged howls and screams as he began to regurgitate a venomous black substance and tear away the skin of his face. I found it in me to scream once more as I felt the blinding flash searing my mind. I felt my head hang limp again, facing the cauldron below me. My breathing was heavy, as though my lungs were starved, and my vision was slow to recompose itself. My head was swarming, unable to comprehend the ghoulish scene I'd just witnessed. Who are they, and why were they killing each other? I was allowed no avenue to express my questioning to the acolyte before he forced my head upwards once more to meet his gaze. Before I could so much as gasp, he pinched my nostrils together, forcing my mouth open and jamming the blade inside. My struggles failed me again as I felt the blade slice into the root of my tongue, once more reciting that damning chant. My abilities to scream were nulled by my choking as the warm, metallic taste of blood flooded my throat. Like with the rest, my severed tongue was cast into the cauldron. For a moment, I felt I was finally close to death as I sputtered and wheezed, choking on my own blood. Of course, I was again denied this end to my punishment when the acolyte revealed a glowing, scalding shard of iron and forced it into my mouth, cauterizing the gash where my tongue once was. I truly began to wonder in that moment if I'd not perhaps perished, as many of the others had on the night of the festival, the night it happened, and that I was now condemned to suffer eternally in this abattoir of crimson-stained stone and mortar. Weakly, and with depleted vision, I watched as he used the knife to sever the wires binding my limbs, causing me to plummet to the cold, unforgiving stone, before silently collecting the cauldron and exiting the chamber through the stairway at the right end. I was left to lie in a pool of blood, my body broken and rent. As the void crept upon the corners of my vision once more, I began to dream. The image to haunt my subconscious mind was that of Jennifer, her vibrant blonde hair, her sweet and warm smile. I began to recollect her softly sweet laughter as we embraced amidst a cheering crowd. I could feel a tear betray me as I remembered the kiss we shared as the blinding blazes burst, illuminating all to a definite degree. The tears came more freely, and horror clouded my reasonable thoughts as the sounds of their collective screams pervaded the air around us. My petrified somnambulism lasted no further, however, when I felt hands grab my wrists and begin dragging me across the stone floor, a trail of blood marking the path behind. Looking up, I could see the blurred visage of a scarlet-garbed acolyte pulling me further into the hallway. I could see but little as I was brought further into the winding staircase, for only a few torches were placed down the long stone spiral. My body throbbed and ached with every inch that I was dragged along, the exposed muscles and tissue grinding against the rough, cold stone. As I was brought nearer and nearer to the end of the stairs, I began to hear a succession of some of the most tortured wails I've ever heard. I almost was certain they couldn't be human. Horrific truth would prove me otherwise, however, when I was dragged out of the stairway and into a new chamber where there was a displayed woman bound in much a similar manner as I had been. Her suffering, however, was of a wholly more vicious nature. She was mounted upon a giant spear in between her legs, her ankles bound in such a way that forced her legs open. Her unheeded shrieks for mercy reached an insufferable degree as I saw two of the acolytes then began to cut across her painfully slender stomach, collecting the robbed viscera into a cauldron just as they had with me. Unable to bear witness to the vile act any longer, I closed my eyes and did my best to take quiet solace in the fact that it wasn't my Jennifer enduring this inhuman torture. It was for naught, however, as I felt myself being hoisted upright by my arms. My eyes opened once more to see them bringing the cauldron closer to me. In an instant, my head was forced down into it, and the acolyte began to force handfuls of the entrails into my mouth. My aching body was too weak to offer any meaningful resistance as he forced the ill-gotten gore down my throat, causing me to gasp and choke. As they did this, I could only distinguish a single, monotonous phrase over the poor woman's screams.
Atreoke Melius.
I was given no time to ponder what that phrase meant before my head was forced from the cauldron to see one of the acolytes holding a dark grail to my slack jaw. With preternatural speed and ferocity, my head was snatched back, and the viscous black liquid contained in the night-shaded grail was poured into my helplessly agape mouth. The substance was thick and warm, making swallowing it nearly impossible. When the last of it was emptied, I began to feel as though the blood-stained confinement was warping around me. The further I fell into a dizzying trance, the more that mysterious mantra cycled incessantly in my mind. I began to perceive the utterance of the words taking on a discordant quality, as if it was originally from the throats of men, women, and beasts alike, all in perfect unison. That was when, amidst the distorted chaos that was the chamber around me, I saw it for the first time. This being, nay, this force appeared to me from the midst of a crimson glow with an avatar that resembled a human being only in posture and general shape. The body was sexless and without skin, comprised merely of exposed muscle tissue and organs. The extremities were long and slender, such that laymen may consider them frail, with long, razor-edged talons at the end of its digits that threatened to disembowel any living creature with but a swift stroke. It was the entity's head that nearly broke the meager hold I still had with my sanity. The being was without a face, without identity. In place of that was what appeared to be a mass of twisted, clammy flesh that wriggled and pulsed as if a living, beating heart were encased within. I could feel the entity's cacophonous vocals resonating, beating like a drum within my mind.
Atreoke Melius.
The entity repeated as it outstretched a slender, skinless left hand and bore its taloned claws deep within my chest. Be it either a product of the delirium addling my mind, or of whatever ethereal force it was manipulating, I felt no pain, and yet it was excruciating as the sinewy digits grasped tightened around my heart. From all around me, I began to hear, as well as feel, their collective screams again. My body became numb as the arm of the entity slowly fused deeper and deeper into my chest. The more my body continued to join with its, the louder, clearer, and more pronounced the screams became. Even in telling this, I cannot accurately comprehend the nature of the anguished wailing. It was as though 1,000 men, women, and children were crying out in a blood-drunk frenzy, having lost themselves to some sort of hysteria. I began to see them all once again, clustered together with eyes of rage and tearing each other apart with teeth and nails alike. The confines around me continued to shift, morphing into a representation of the night of the festival. All around me I watched as the glowing fireworks illuminated a holocaust. The pressure on my heart tightened as, in petrified sorrow, I was forced to relive that night when I watched those I once knew as family and friends who'd gathered in celebration of my engagement to my beloved slaughter each other.
This time was different, however, in that I didn't merely hear or see the carnage, but felt it. Every scratch, every bite, I felt it all. Physically, viscerally, and mentally. Once they had feasted upon their once fellow brethren, I saw them turn their feral ire upon themselves, ripping and tearing at their own flesh, with their eyes draining of that same venom that I'd witnessed in the Acolyte's earlier mirage.
Jubilex, Sanctus, Malleus,
they said to the skies above before falling dead upon gore-ridden earth.
What had begun with blood and flesh,
The distorted voice boomed in my head.
so too shall it end and be reborn in that image.
In that instance, I felt as though my own body began to unravel itself, watching in horrific revulsion as my own flesh stripped itself away. I screamed out in abject terror when all of a sudden, I felt once again the cold stone beneath me. Dazed and hysterical, I examined my environment to find that it no longer resembled the damning premonition. I saw that I was once more being towed down a dim corridor. The further they tugged my battered and shredded body, the more clearly I was able to distinguish distant recitals of the familiarly archaic chanting from ahead. I heard the repetitions echo off the stone walls of the hall. The more I listened, the more I began to hear the phantom whispers.
Flesh for the faceless one.
What do they mean? With the little time I would have to ponder that query, the entity's statement continued to pervade my reasonable thoughts. Reaching the end of the prolonged hallway, I was hoisted gracelessly to my feet by two of the acolytes. Before me was the very same sanctuary from the hallucination. It felt as though I was staring into the very depths of Sheol itself, the only penetrations to the devouring darkness being the small candles arranged around the gaping pit at the far end of the room. Despite the paltry illumination, I clearly saw the idol from the vision towering over the pit. At first glance, it looked to crudely resemble the form of a human being, with its circular ring to form the semblance of a head, and the 4 points beneath to resemble the limbs. It then slowly dawned upon me of the idol's resemblance to the abominable entity who, in of itself, appeared to be but a crude representation of a human. I watched as 3 hooded acolytes who were knelt in worship around the cavernous pit turned to face me, holding aloft their own smaller images of the larger one towering before them and repeating their demoniac tongue. My body remained limp, my feet dragging across the rough stone as the 2 acolytes restraining my arms forced me forward. The chanting grew louder and more abrasive the closer I came to the pit, as well as the whispered omens from before. I tried in vain to shake the ethereal utterance from my thoughts, only seeming to succeed in giving them a tighter grasp on my mind. It was when I was held only mere inches away from the abysmal pit that my senses were offended by a combined carrion miasma of excrement and decay. I felt my stomach start to turn over on itself, and I began to retch. I soon regretted this physical impulse, however, as, with speed, one of the acolytes before me used the piercing edge of its idol to slice across his palm, producing venomous black blood before forcing me to consume it once again. Then, before I could so much as gasp in fright, I was cast like waste into the Abaddon depths of the pit. With a crushing impact, I met the floor of the pit. Unlike the rough, coarse stone in the rest of the tower, the ground was smooth like marble. For a prolonged period of time, I just laid there, splayed out in the center of the pit and looking up at the dark expanse above as the scarlet-garbed figures returned my gaze down at me. I watched as they uniformly raised their idols to the air once more, reciting the chant, before dispersing from the mouth of the pit. Had I possessed my tongue, I would have had in that moment cried out to God, beckoning as to why I'd been forsaken in this manner. As it happened, I'd need not to have voiced this anguished query to receive its answer. Soon after they dispersed from the pit, a loud groan, as though from a dying mule, rang out from the darker regions of the pit that laid beyond the sparsely illuminated radius from directly under the mouth. My body tensed as I heard the source of the groans grow nearer, the soft shuffling of its movement growing ever closer to the center. Despite feeling the adrenaline coursing through my veins, I laid stiff both from pain as well as crippling fear, I couldn't even bring myself to close my eyes, that I might be spared the witness of a possibly gruesome end at the whims of whatever vile creature was skulking towards me.
It chose me.
What began as minute relief that the creature from the abysmal recesses was human quickly devolved into dread as I recognized the man to be that of my best friend and the elder brother of my dearest Jennifer, Wallace. I felt as though a millstone had been hanged around my heart, sending it plummeting from my chest. During the nigh endless days and night I spent in torment in the tower, I was most certain that he'd met his demise, like many, at the hands of our ravenous brethren. Seeing him here, I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps that could have been a more graceful fate. With his face now illuminated, I saw that both of his eyes had been forcefully gouged out, leaving 2 dark red craters in their place. The more illuminated he became, the more of his disfigurements I saw all over his body. It was as though the jaws of some savage beast had mauled him, leaving not an inch of skin without laceration. He crept closer to me, somehow able to propel himself forward on his hands and feet with an almost animalistic level of agility. Despite the appearance of his exposed, shredded tendons and ligaments,
"The flesh is abhorred and must be ended,"
I heard him mumble as he closed the distance.
"The world must be reborn in the image of flesh."
No sooner than the deranged declaration left his lips, he bounded through the air like a panther and pinned me to the floor of the pit. Despite having more of my body intact than he, I was completely unable to wrestle against him. Wallace's empty eye sockets began to excrete the familiar black liquid as he barked at the top of his lungs.
"Adreoke adue jubilex, flesh for the faceless one."
Before sinking his teeth into the bridge of my nose, I howled and writhed in pain as I struggled beneath his grasp to no avail. My screams escalated to painful proportions as his teeth dug in and ripped away the skin of my nose and devoured it. "This is it," I conceded as I closed my eyes, waiting for the feral beast that was once my closest friend to tear me apart. That was when, from outside the circle of light, an ear-shattering screech rang out. In an instant, I felt the weight of Wallace being forced off me. When I opened my eyes, I looked over to see that a newcomer from the dark recesses had pounced upon Wallace and was wrestling him to the pit floor. I watched as the attacker began strangling Wallace, uttering rabid growls as they did so. Wallace retaliated by using his fingernails to slash the attacker's face, successfully ripping a gash open in their right cheek. This caused them to retract in pain. Seizing the opportunity to attack, Wallace pounced upon his opponent and began to sink his teeth into their cheek and tear a large region of it asunder.
"The flesh is abhorred and must be reborn in its image,"
Wallace shouted, letting out a hysterical cackle as he struggled to hold his attacker down. Looking closer, I saw the pain and fright in the attacker's eyes as Wallace unhinged his jaws for another attack. A haunting familiarity struck me fiercely when I saw the twinkle of innocence in those eyes as well. It was something I had not seen since... No. Please, no. Wallace let out an inhuman shriek as he clamped his teeth around his attacker's right ear, tearing it clean from their head. I winced as the screams became nearly deafening. I then watched as he sunk his teeth into their throat and spat out a portion of it almost half the size of my palm. Seeing the severed gore land only inches away from me, I spotted something glinting in the dim light. My heart froze when, upon examination, the reflective object was revealed to be the very diamond-encrusted locket I placed around the neck of my beloved wife-to-be. I looked up once more at the brutal struggle to see Wallace begin to tear away the skin of his face as he proclaimed,
"The faceless one chose me to be reborn in the image of flesh."
The attacker, my sweet Jennifer, laid pinned beneath him, profusely bleeding from the gash in her throat.
"Adreoke adue jubilex sanctus melios,"
I heard coming from the mouth of the pit.
"I hear their call. Flesh for the faceless one, harbinger of rebirth,"
Wallace said, having completely removed the skin from his face. The venomous black ichor began gushing from his mouth as well as his eye sockets. With a mysterious vigor coursing through me, perhaps driven by the desire to protect my love from further harm at the hands of her brother, I found myself to my feet and lunged at Wallace as he reared back for another attack. To both my own and his amazement, I was able to successfully intercept his assault and restrain him on the ground. As I struggled to keep him pinned, my head began to pound with every uttered syllable of the acolyte's recited incantations from above. With the venom gagging him, Wallace lashed out that he heard the summons of the entity, that he was the chosen one to be reborn in the image of flesh. It was in that very instant that the cacophonous vocals of the abominable entity spoke to me in whispers that were almost hypnotic in nature.
Do it. End him.
It barked.
For the flesh is weak and is undeserving of rebirth.
I will be reborn in its image, he gurgled, writhing beneath me. The pulsing in my head became more frantic, the Faceless One's commands echoing through my head. I tried to shake its voice from my thoughts. That was when a volley of images flooded through my mind. I began to see the flesh of every living creature peel from the bones as if it were mere parchment. I could again perceive their tortured cries echoing as they looked up to the skies, their shed, fleshy pelts soaking into the bowels of the earth. I saw them prostrate themselves before the Faceless Ones who held dominance from the sky above.
They have been reborn with purer flesh,
it stated.
End him now, that you may be reborn in flesh.
I began to feel something for the first of what would be many times to come in that moment as I watched the skinless creatures in the vision start to tear each other apart. I felt a primal urge to feed. All at once, I could feel a blinding rage take hold of me as I looked to see Wallace beneath me, struggling, now at my mercy. I could feel myself slipping into the ravenous temptation. All it would take, I silently reasoned, was one strike to his throat. Then he'd be in a pool of blood alongside his sister. Hate burned inside of me as I chanced to look back to see my dearest Jennifer's body sprawled motionless, blood now encircling her head. He killed her, I thought to myself, returning my gaze to Wallace's empty eye sockets. This bastard that I once called a friend had just murdered his own sister, my fiancée. I felt the throbbing with an immeasurable intensity as I bared my teeth and ripped into his throat. I could hear him cry out as he struggled beneath me. New sensations coursed through my entire body. With every second, my teeth burrowed further and further into his skin, savoring the warm crimson river that flowed down my throat. Earthquakes were erupting in my head, and I felt as though it would explode. My eyes began to burn as the venomous discharge ran freely down my face. Such intensity caused me to raise up and scream to the mouth of the pit above, just as Wallace and the others before. The burning was excruciating, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to attempt gouging my eyes out. Overtaken by my newfound feral ire, I proceeded to repeatedly bash Wallace's head into the ground. I didn't stop until I heard the satisfying, distinct sound of his skull splitting. I howled and roared to the air like the unbound ape I had degraded myself to in that moment as my head continued to pound and quake.
Frederick!
The cooing voice was soft, broken, yet oddly soothing. I almost didn't hear it first, having lost myself to the savage hysteria.
Frederick!
This time, it was cried out from behind me. I looked back to see my Jennifer alive. Slowly, I returned to my former state of reason. I got my first clear look at her. Her once entrancing face was marred nearly beyond recognition. Despite this, her eyes bore no falsehood. This was, indeed, my Jennifer. I croaked out, unable to form the necessary syllables.
Frederick. My Frederick.
Her voice was faint and fading. I hastily crawled over to her and cradled her in my arms. As disfigured as she appeared, I was still hopelessly entranced by her eyes. I leaned down and planted a kiss upon her torn, scarred lips. A long-forgotten sense of warmth and tranquility flowed through my body as I held her close to my chest. I nestled my head to hers as she allowed herself to drift into a quiet slumber. For hours I held her, studying her sweet face that I'd feared I'd never see again, feeling her warm and steady breaths upon my tattered skin. Something began to twist inside of me, however. I began to fervently ponder how vulnerable she looked, cradled like a child in my arms. It, too, would be easy, just like Wallace. It was then that my head started pounding again, the cacophonous voice booming.
End her. The flesh is weak and detested.
No, please, not her, I silently cried. My eyes began to burn as it demanded again with malicious vigor.
End her. Return her to the flesh of the earth that you may be reborn.
In what would be a vain attempt to combat the Cacodemon's will, I laid her down and scurried away from her into the darkest region of the pit. I felt as though a raging fire had been set alight in my head. My head felt near to bursting, and I began to drive it into the wall of the pit with hopes of, in one way or another, escaping this. Eventually, the darkness indeed welcomed me again. I drifted in an endless limbo for what felt to be just shy of an eternity. The hope of a merciful demise, however, was extinguished as the void around me shifted into a display of the outer cosmos. Once more, I watched as the Faceless One emerged from the blazing orb that penetrated the abysmal expanse. I felt weak with dread at the sight.
You think you can deny rebirth simply by expiring yourself?
Its chaotic bellow shook my presently frantic heartbeat. What are you? What is this place? I was at a loss. Why wasn't I allowed to be at peace?
You were made, like all things that be of this world, in the image of the flesh of me.
As it spoke, the glowing orb hailing the Faceless One expanded. I felt a scalding sensation when the orb crept upon and swallowed me whole, causing me to tightly close my eyes.
Look around you.
Opening my eyes, I saw the earth, a quiet yet peaceful display. What is this? I beckoned. Be this an illusion?
Nay, you are merely witnessing the end of a cycle.
All around me, I watched as primitive wildlife grazed peacefully about in a wide, lush grove. Oddly, I felt a comforting warmth flow through me in observing them. With but a swift pass of its naked hand, however, the formerly gentle creatures became hostile. I watched in revulsion as even the young of the various herds were remorselessly ripped apart. "Stop this!" I cried out to it. I was given no response as the massacre continued. Eventually, there was but one of the creatures remaining, a grizzly who, upon its victory, roared to the skies above in berserk delirium as it rended the flesh from its bones. Slowly, I saw the littered carcasses spread across the soil until it formed an entirely new landscape comprised solely of living flesh. All across the horizon, the flesh soil expanded. I was disgusted and horrified at the sight of the hellscape that surrounded me, pulsing and quaking just as that which comprised the malevolent being's head. "What have you done?" I shouted to it, my mind in danger of breaking irrevocably.
What has always happened when the flesh becomes abhorrent and must be reborn? That is how life continues.
Just then, the sinewy land below started to undulate and protrude upward. As it did this, I noticed how it molded itself into the form of a man. Like an infant at birth, the creature blasted a shrill cry as it drew in the breath of life and opened its yellow eyes. I then witnessed more of the same phenomena when more of men and beasts alike were birthed shrieking from the primordial flesh. "What manner of hell is this?"
Heaven and hell,
it thundered,
are only the mere philosophical constructs of feeble flesh.
"What are you?" I stammered, stripped of my ability to compose myself. In front of me, the newborn, skinless man's eyes flooded with venom as he opened his mouth, speaking in the entity's discordant tongue as a conduit.
I am the world, for the world is bound from flesh, and I am flesh.
"You lie!" I rebutted in a pitiful defiance. "You're evil! You slaughtered innocents!"
I have done nothing. What has occurred is what has always been preordained. It was you that corrupted them, that damned them."
With that, the grotesque creature began to mold into a morbidly familiar appearance, forming the gaunt face and thin body of Wallace. The voice boomed through the mouth once more.
"This is your doing. What you have deemed as damnation is merely that which was only natural for beings of the flesh."
I covered my ears and closed my eyes, demanding the being to silence its lying tongue. All around me, I began to hear more of the maddening wails of birth until I was eventually forced to open my eyes once more. In doing so, I was met again with the depths of the pit. As I laid numb, my head still aching from the blunt trauma I subjected myself to, I slowly lolled my head around